Today is Tuesday, June 9th, 2009. My name is Frida Reitman, and it's my pleasure to interview today Evelyn Fowler at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. I've been looking forward to this day.
I've been looking forward to it too.
I think we should start with your birth family, a little bit about your background. I noticed that you were born in Hartford and your parents were both born in Europe.
That's right.
So if you know why they came and settled to Hartford, that would be an interesting place to start.
Well, my mother came here at the age of 12, I think. Her father had come 2 years before. This was around 18, well, she was 12, she was born, it must have been 1905 or 06 or something like that. Her father had come originally with her older brother, and then he went back to Europe, left the brother here, and the two daughters, my mother and her older sister, came to the United States in 1895. And my mother, I think they stayed with an aunt of mine who was already here, who had come much earlier. And then they got jobs as, I don't know what they call them, they were sort of mother's helpers. They lived with the family in the apartment, and these girls really had no, they didn't know anything. They knew how to do the things that we don't know how to do. They could sew, things like that. But my mother figured she was not going to sit around and do nothing, and she immediately found a place to learn English, which was a settlement in New York City, which is still around, I guess, a famous one. Mm-hmm. And she learned English, and when she learned well enough to be able to read it without too much trouble, she looked at the daily paper and found a job in the help wanted sections. And she must have been, maybe she was 14 by this time. And all these kids were educated because they were all in Poland, where under the German,
The Austro-Hungarian Empire.
right, so that they were given an education. A lot of the people who came from other parts of Poland had no schooling at all. I mean, especially the girls. So they knew how to read, they knew how to write, not English, but at least they knew what they were doing.
German, probably. That's what they got in school then, I think.
I don't
Polish?
know what my mother learned. She went to, it was a school that was run by the nuns, and they were taught, how to do things. But I don't know, really, I never thought to ask her what she learned in school.
It's interesting because my mother came from that area, and she was going to school in German, which was easy for her compared to the Polish kids.
Right. Well, I asked my mother, my mother used to speak Polish, and she could sort of make her way a little bit in Russian. Now, how she did that, I don't know, because they were not really in the Russian area at all.
Right.
My father's family, my mother stayed in New York for a number of years. She learned a trade, a very good trade, making women's hats out of straw, which they did on a sewing machine, and it's a highly skilled trade. And she did that when, I guess, she met my father, who was a very active, lively young guy who wrote poetry and was involved in politics and things like that at the age of 20, 21 in New York City. And they were married, and I guess my sister was born, I guess, a couple of years later in New York. And then they decided, meanwhile, the older sister, my mother's older sister, my aunt, had married, and her husband and she moved up to Hartford. This must have been, I would say, 1918, something of that era. And when, and the older brother by this time, also was married. He was married to a sister, and my aunt married a brother, and his sister married my uncle. And when they were all established in Hartford, had been established for a few years, and then my mother and father moved up with us, and with me, with them, because I was born up there. And they had grocery stores. My mother's in-laws, these brother-in-law and sister-in-law, were both, that was one of these families that always made money. I don't know how they were. They were not nice people. They had a very common name. We have a lot of people by that name here in town. And anyhow, that's where I come from. I was born there in Hartford. We lived there for about 18 years, until we moved down to New York. Then my father died when I was 13 of a kidney disease, which in those days they just died of kidney disease. They didn't do a thing about it. They waited. And my mother had, they had a grocery store. They continued with the grocery store. And then my sister went to college in Philadelphia, and I wanted to go to art school, and I wanted to go to Pratt Institute. And my mother asked me, she suggested that I go to the division of UConn, which is now UConn, but they had a school in New Britain, which I think is called Central Connecticut State College, I don't know, that at that time was mostly for teachers. And she said, look, if you go there, go to New Britain, because we were living in Hartford, which is just a city out. She said, I'll get you a car, and, all these wonderful things with the thoughts. And she said, and you can commute. I said, Ma, I don't want to be a teacher. The last thing I want to do is be a teacher. So she said, okay. So she sold the store, and we moved down to New York. We moved to Brooklyn, and my mother was able to get a job in the business that she had left many years before. She worked even when I was a little kid. She always worked before women worked, and the reason she did is because my father never earned a living. He was a very talented guy, but he was one of these guys who never did earn a living. So we moved down to Brooklyn, which was only about a mile, or not too far from where Pratt Institute is. And I went to Pratt Institute, the art school. And by the time I was there for 2 years, I realized that, I had as much talent as anybody else. I could do things. I always drew very well. And I used to love doing that sort of thing. But I felt this is not my thing. And the reason it wasn't my thing was because I didn't have the right attitude or the right feeling or emotion or whatever it was. I felt that these people took themselves so seriously, and they thought they were really hot stuff. Some of them were and some of them weren't. But I never really felt that way about myself. I've never felt this is my soul. It had nothing to do with that. I used to do it because I mechanically was able to do this sort of thing. And, but you stay with it. I eventually graduated, and by this time we were in WW2. I have to stop and think. I keep thinking it doesn't World War I. And the only thing that happened that I was told about in World War I is my father got flu, the kind of flu they used to, and they used to think that maybe that's what left him with a peculiar situation with the kidneys, which wasn't that much later. But anyhow, I got it, I worked for a while, and meanwhile, I was designing lace. you have to design lace. And they sent me up to their factory up in Rhode Island to see the way it was done, which was really very, very interesting. And but I felt the design of lace, and it was, well, at that age, at the age of 20 or 21 or whatever it was, because I was pretty young, it didn't. I didn't think in terms of lifetime anything. I just did what came along, and I was told about various courses the government was offering for young people or for anybody, and there was for free. You just applied and you took the tests and whatever they offered if you were interested. They had one series for engineering, and I thought, that sounds as though it might be interesting. You do say it's mechanical drawing, engineering, and all that sort of stuff. So I took the exam for it, and I got a letter said I'd passed, and I figured, and then I waited for them to tell me what to do next. And then I got a call from them that said, but you made a mistake on your application. I said, what mistake? They said, well, you put down that you never had geometry. I said, no, I never had geometry. I went through high school without geometry. Well, you can't take that engineering course. You got to have geometry. I said, okay. So what they had was a mechanical drawing course at the college in Jersey City, whose name for the life of me I forgot, but I forget everything. Not Phillips. Stevens Institute. That was close. It's now Stevens University. But anyhow, it was Stevens Institute. So I used to take a subway from my house, which took me down to the Hudson Tubes, which is downtown, and then had to take another one through the tubes into New Jersey, and then walk over to Stevens Institute, which is right along the river. And in those days, you never think about anything happening. I did this at night, and then, you do it. I would never forget somebody when we were living in Brooklyn. We lived in one of those brownstone houses near Pratt, and that time was still a nice neighborhood. I think it's even nicer now. And I remember one of the neighbors said, oh, we're terribly upset because I came home late. And she said, you got to be careful. But I said, nothing ever happened to me. So I figured, didn't worry about these things. Anyhow, I went to Stevens, took the course, which was interesting, and met one of my teachers was a young fellow who taught, he was an engineer, and he suggested a job in his company, which was in New Jersey. And I don't know, I did it, but in addition to everything else, after I got off the subway in New Jersey, I took a bus to a town farther in, and Passaic, they call it, Passaic, New Jersey, and I worked there for it must have been about a year or so, and then from that point, from there at the end of there was that must have been a downturn in the business or something. I had a terrible boss. I couldn't stand him, but didn't take too much to get me out of there. But what they did is they actually shut down a whole department. I was part of the department, and I remembered one of the customers, I guess you'd call him, one of the clients that we did work for. We made we made cabinets, long, big. All these things were for the Army, for the Navy. They had electrical cabinets and stuff like that. And one of them, one of our customers was in Brooklyn. So I figured, okay, I'll look them up. So when I was no longer working in New Jersey, I looked up this place in Brooklyn. It turned out to be right at the end of a line, not very far from where we lived. And I applied for a job there. And and at the same time I applied to one of the great big companies, like it wasn't one of the big electrical companies. And both places offered me a job. But one of them was downtown, the big one was downtown with all the big buildings and all that stuff that usually enthrall people. I didn't like it. So I took the other job, which was out in the wilds of Brooklyn. And I went to work as a draftsman. And my husband was the president of that company. And he was like 6.5 or 7 years older than me. He had a partner who was drafted into the Navy, and they had another partner who was a Frenchman who had been brought over here during that war. During the Second World War, they had in England, they had people of great value from some of the countries that had been occupied, and they had a submarine set up for these people who would be brought to this country if they invaded England, so that they can continue their work. I really don't know what they were doing. Well, they were designing very big machines and things that were used to make airplanes and stuff like that. And this Frenchman, was one of these people. Anyhow, I went to work for this company, and after a while, I started going out with my boss. And after an engagement, I think of about 4 weeks, I said, okay, look, I'm willing to get married. And so we were married at that time. And I didn't go back to work at the business because there were a couple of women in the office, and when you get things get very gossipy. And we felt it would probably be a better idea not to go to work at the office. So I didn't. But then I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself? So Alex, my husband, his name was Alex, said, why don't you go to school? I thought, you're school? I mean, as it happened, I liked school because I was always a good student. And no matter what they taught me, whatever they told me to learn, I used to learn. And in addition, he had a first cousin, one of his very few male first cousins. He got a pile of female first cousins. And this one male first cousin was an engineer, and he worked for the U.S. government. And they have an armament plant. They had an armament plant in Washington, D.C. I think it may still be there, I don't know. And he was married to a young woman from Brooklyn who had never been to college, also a very bright girl. And when they moved down to Washington, she went to the University of Maryland, which was outside of the city, and went and graduated in the engineering school with the highest grades of anybody. Alex used to tell me about them. At that time, I don't know if I knew them, but I got to know them. We became very, very close friends. So she was sort of somebody that it would be interesting to follow.
A mentor?
Yeah. Well, they have never, whatever. Anyhow, so I said, okay. So we lived near Pratt. We lived right near there. And I checked with Columbia, and they didn't want me. They suggested I go to their school to Barnard. I think I was 22 at the time. Because after all, I was married. I was too old for that sort of thing. And the NYU, they were all the way uptown. The engineering school was way up north. And I tried the school in Polytechnic Institute in Brooklyn. Brooklyn Poly it was. Now it's Polytechnic University or something. They all have become universities. And they were very nice, but they said, we're sorry, we can't take you because we haven't got any women's toilets. Whatever. So I said,
You didn't offer to use the men's.
You know, it never occurred to me. In those days, you wouldn't do things like that. I probably wouldn't have gone then.
Right.
Anyhow, so I said, look, and go to Pratt. So I went over to Pratt, and they had an engineering school at that time, which is now closed. They no longer have the school. And there was no problem. I was applied, I got in, and I went to engineering school. And we decided at the time, Alex was an electrical engineer. Chemical engineering has a lot of mechanical engineering in it because it isn't, the chemistry is not the major thing in chemical engineering. It's they build factories for making chemicals, so we figured maybe if I studied chemical engineering, it would be, you know, we cover a lot of engineering between us. So that's what happened. I studied chemical engineering, and it wasn't a big problem.
How many women were at Pratt?
At the time I went, the most there were about 5.
Out of what, 100? 200?
Gee, I really don't know. There must have been at least there probably more than that. And we had some of these. We had people who were very, very much against having women there. We had an old guy, I remember, in the foundry, and we had a foundry there.
Were the other women married? Or were you the only one?
I was the only one I was the old one. I was 23 maybe.
Right, okay.
And
a pioneer even then.
well, you know, I just do what people tell me to do, I guess. But, you know, no problem. Gave me something to do. When I had completed about 2.5 or 3 years, something, then I became pregnant, and we decided it was time to have a baby. And I had my oldest son, and coming back after that was very difficult, not because it was difficult, it was because my schedule was all screwed up. But you know, we managed, we always do. And then by that time, we moved up to Stamford.
Finally, we got you to Stanford.
The reason, how we came to Stanford, I was thinking about this when I knew you were coming. I was thinking, how did we get to Stanford? And I was remembering, they had, Les, maybe you remember this, they had an organization where they had all the 3 religions, the Jews, the Christians, and anybody else around. It was, I remember it was fairly well known, and if I didn't, you know, if I were 40 years younger, I'd remember, but I don't, what the name of it was. They had a very well-known theologian, Protestant theologian who headed it.
It was the Interfaith Council.
Maybe, whatever it was, I remember it was very, and that appealed to both of us because while I lived in West Hartford and West Hartford, we were usually the only Jews there. And I never had any problem, truthfully, because I always got along with a lot of people. I was an amiable kid, nobody, you know, and I was smart. So they didn't have anything against me. My sister was smart but was not very amiable, and she didn't have as easy a time as I did. She's 2.5 years older than I. And, but I had long since decided that wherever we go, I want to be I want not for my kids not to be the only Jews on the bus or the only Jews in the school, which we were. And when this, I don't even remember how we found out about this, but when we heard about this, it was very intriguing. We started coming up here to see what we could find. And actually, we bought this property in 1949. And I have
this meaning where we are
piece,
today?
This 2-acre chunk right in here. But we didn't, my husband got a builder, he found a contractor who would build it this was during the next war.
Korean.
Yeah, who can remember? And a friend of his who was an owner of a lot of property in the Bronx, one of his buddies, said, you can get a great, they're giving a very good mortgage. I remember the name of the company, of the bank was the Century Federal and something. And we got a 3.5% mortgage. You had to put up, I think, half of the value of the property, which in those days was nothing, but a 3.5% mortgage in 17 years, the mortgage was paid on. So my husband, who was a much better businessman than I ever was, said this is something to look into, and that's what we did. So we bought the property, and he got a contractor, and we went and decided found the property, which is on a slope, so we decided we could have a full, downstairs above grade, which we do, and the house wasn't built, and it wasn't finished until about 52, because the builder went broke, and then we found out they made a mistake in something that, that my husband was doing this, by this time he was doing the overseeing. So it was a very difficult thing. We were living in Brooklyn, at that time had 2 little boys, and by the time we moved up here, the older one was already in nursery school. Across the street from our house, there was a Delphi Academy, had a nursery school. And, but I remember we'd come up, that was before there was any turnpike, come up on the post road, and we took the three little kids, and we used to dress them all the same. And it was a whole adventure. It went on for a couple of years. So we moved in.
So you had a third child too?
I had my third son. Was he born before we? Yeah, he was 15 months old when we moved here. So when we first bought the property, I only had two. And we moved up here and moved into this house on the August 10th, 1952. I can't remember. It was 51 or 52. And I've been here ever since.
And you had another child?
Oh, I had my little girl was born after we were living here. She was actually, and the fact is that when we moved up here, their kids really they never ran into any anti-Semitic problems, or the kinds of things that I was aware of.
You're talking about here, Stanford now.
Right. In fact, as I said, that was the reason, one of the big reasons we moved here. I mean, I never even thought in terms of Greenwich. Greenwich has a reputation for being Greenwich, and I didn't want to get involved with that kind of a reputation.
Had you looked at temples or synagogues at all before you came? Because you say that was one of the things that you were interested in.
That's true.
And I know you've been very active in Temple Sinai.
Only in the last 10 or 15 or maybe 20 years, I don't know.
30?
But there was only the temple, the
synagogue.
Yeah, not the synagogue, which I wasn't even interested in,
Right.
and Bethel, which was down, or downtown.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, my oldest son started in first grade at their nursery school at Temple Bethel. And then they started building Temple Sinai. And my husband said, no, he couldn't have been less interested in anything. Now, he came from a part of Brooklyn where they used to beat up the Jewish kids. And I guess he managed to keep out of trouble. They had he used to tell us stories about some of the people who became well-known gangsters. But I was the one who insisted on this. I guess maybe because I was exposed to it as a little, and I was aware of it, being Jewish, being the Jewish kid. And so when they built Temple Sinai, the second year it was built, not the first year, we were not the originals. We did whatever we had to do to join, and we stayed with them for until the kids all got confirmed. In those days, they didn't have very many bar mitzvahs. My two older boys had bar mitzvahs because, well, the oldest one, because his very close friend, who is now a millionaire in Costa Rica, incidentally, which is nice. I'm still close friends with his family who live down in Florida. He and this boy we were all very close friends, even though we didn't go to the same temple. And Stephen was having a bar mitzvah, which was routine for Temple Bethel. And Joe felt, well, if Stephen has a bar mitzvah, I gotta have a bar mitzvah. So it was kind of a half-assed bar mitzvah, I must say. You didn't have to learn very much. They taught them Hebrew in the Sunday school. The kids all went through Sunday school.
Who was the rabbi then? Was Silver here yet?
Silver most of the time. When we first started, it was the young one, Ed, whose name I don't remember just as well. He was sort of ushered out quietly, but in disgrace. Got involved with one of his parishioners' wives.
Was it Thompson? Was that his name?
What was his?
Was it Thompson?
No, his
No,
name was.
Jewish. I remember what he looked like.
I'll remember sooner or later. He had a simple name. He was, he was one of the popular types that they liked for Reform temples. He was blonde. He didn't have a Jewish name. But then Silver came in, and all through, he was there during all the time the kids were there. So they all went through, so Joe got a bar mitzvah. In fact, I think it was I don't remember if it was in the first little building we had or not, but they didn't do them the way they do now. And then a couple of years later, because Joe had a bar mitzvah, Ivan wanted a bar mitzvah, so he got a bar mitzvah. And Dan didn't want to know about anything, so that was the end of that. But they all stayed in Sunday school until they were confirmed, which was 9th grade, I think. And that's when I was involved, and I used to be moderately involved. I really didn't have a lot of time for that sort of thing, and I didn't become terribly friendly with anybody that I did know a lot of people, but it wasn't anything special. And at the time I was working, all this period, my husband had brought his business up here to Stamford, and I was working with him, and not at the factory. He always had factory space, but we had, because of our basement, which is not a basement, we had a full suite of offices downstairs, including a very nice bathroom, which is still there, and large rooms, and an entrance in the back. And I used to have two women. I had a secretary, and then I had another woman who used to help sometimes, answer the telephone and stuff like that. In fact, the secretary I had for 17 years, very nice woman. And so I was, I helped set up the office, and I did all that sort of stuff. Occasionally helped out when I could. Someone asked me recently about what did I do as far as my engineering was concerned, and the interesting things in all the years that we were in business, and the company still exists, incidentally, my son is running it. All the years we were in business, once I had to do something that involved chemical engineering that my husband didn't know about. He had we had to make, they were making something for a big company up in Massachusetts that had presses that would make the wing of one of their big airplanes, and one, go down once and make a wing. And it involved heat exchanging or something. Well, in chemical engineering, we had a lot of time about heat exchange. My husband didn't know that much about it. So I actually figured something out for him, and I thought, wow, that's all my chemical engineering. But that was the only thing I actually remember that really applied to what I had learned.
But I know you were part of the Women in Chemical Engineers, right?
Oh yeah, women.
So you had joined it even though you were not you didn't feel you were working in
Oh,
chemical?
no, we wouldn't have joined it, we started it. I was one of the founding fathers or mothers of that outfit. And which is quite a big it's quite a known organization at this time. I was one of the I was one of the original. In fact, that's well, the reason I can remember a lot of this stuff is because I was looking through some of the stuff that I had, and it's only now, well, in the last number of years. As a matter of fact, we started a section here in Connecticut, right up here. It started here in this house, but it was. I'll tell you, my daughter was 2 years old at the time. So. Say it out loud.
You haven't told us exactly what your company manufactured. You said it was a manufacturing company.
Yeah, we did. We still manufacture something, believe it or not. We manufactured a number of things, but the things that we manufactured are parts that are used in other machinery, not in machines that you sell, but in machines that make the things that you sell. For example, trying to think we have magnets, electromagnets that are used for a specific purpose, that are, not just a little of them, they're used in presses, press brakes, behind press brakes as safety equipment. That's what most of this stuff is. During the time that my husband was alive, we used to make large machines that would put material into presses or press brakes and deliver it in, take it out again, and stop at various times. And it was always machinery that didn't have a lot of romance, because it was stuff that most people didn't understand. They didn't know what a press brake was. They didn't know what a press was. And it was primarily for that kind of thing. And we are still manufacturing these special magnets that are used with this type of equipment that's considered necessary to operate them. So when people put things in the machines, they don't forget to take their hands out. They don't have to hold them. It's being held otherwise. And that actually was my husband's specialty. He was really an expert in all that type of electronic stuff.
Was there competition in that?
Not really, very little.
It sounds to me like it had a special niche.
Yeah, in fact, we have patents we have a lot of patents, a number of patents. We have a couple of patents that my husband insisted that my name be on, because I may have done some drawings for him, I guess there was something. But, and after my oldest son, who was a patent attorney, in fact, all the kids, my 4 children, there 3 of them are in engineering fields, and my daughter is an architect. My youngest son makes machinery, manufactures machinery, but they don't do it themselves. These things are all given out. They don't have factories. Dan has a shop. Joe we had a factory here in Stanford until a few years ago. We had people working for us when my husband was alive. We had a regular little shop here on the west side with our people. We had about half a dozen people working for us. It was they used to love to work for us, because it was an interesting thing to do, and there were only a half dozen people, and they were paid regular wages. They got everything that everybody else got. And it was a nice operation. None of my kids work for anybody else. I guess that was sort of bred into them, that they don't work for other people. And they're all working for themselves. My daughter has a business, a big business. And anyhow, What was the question?
I think I started out with you and being a woman and a chemical engineer. So did you learn electrical engineering while you were in the business too?
Oh, yeah, well, you know, they're all tangled up. They're all, I mean, what I knew 20 years ago, I don't know anything today. As a matter of fact, one of the things I keep thinking, one of these days I'm gonna have to write a letter, or write an article or something, saying that what's happening to that our generation, not only my generation, but the one, your generation, Frida, which is a half a generation lower, we are so far behind. I mean, we don't even belong in the same universe that the people now. I mean, our knowledge is so diminished, or maybe we never had it, I don't know.
Yeah.
That sometimes you feel as though you're not talking to the same people. It's a tough situation.
There are many foreigners who come here and study. We were just at Cornell graduation and noticed the Masters of Electrical Engineering.
Mhm.
Only one had a name that you would think might be an American name. Wide variety, Chinese, European, Spanish, everything, but
That's right.
not.
That's
So
not American.
they're not going in. The idea that you have to work too hard, I guess, in engineering. But that may change again, who knows?
Yeah, but we're just not,
So you don't have any grandchildren who are into engineering?
grandchildren, they're not, well, yes, my oldest grandson, who is now about 27 or 28, who lives down in Atlanta, he went to Georgia Tech, and he became a chemical, I guess he's a chemical engineer, and he's been working ever since he graduated. You know, he's looking for a girlfriend, anybody nice, needed a nice girlfriend. So I told my son, who lives down there, he lives in Florida, I said, well, tell Alex, all these kids, all my husband died relatively, or before we had any grandchildren, and all the kids, everything, I have 6 grandsons, no, I have 5 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and I think all the grandsons have the name Alexander somewhere, the middle name or something. Well, this oldest one is Alexander, and so I told Ivan to tell Alex to go to join a temple if he wants to meet some girls. Well, that's it doesn't take very. Ivan had some sort of an excuse, but anyhow, what was the question?
Well, we're talking about the lack of engineers
Oh, no,
in
yeah,
our
they're
society now,
Oh,
and which is
right.
really
Well,
something. I don't know
yes.
that affects us in Stamford so much. So, or Lower Fairfield County.
Well, Alex is a chemical engineer. His kid sister is not in that business at all. My next older grandson just got accepted at Rensselaer to as a, what do they do when they hire them sort of, and they eventually get a PhD.
Oh, okay.
And
In
that's
a doctoral program.
Yeah, doctoral program at Rensselaer, but they have to get the kind that the college will help pay for. So that's his number 2 grandson. My 3rd grandson is he's going to become a lawyer, but you have to have some, I guess. My 4th grandson just completed his first year at UConn, which is fine. I have no idea what he's going to be. We're just happy he got through. And the youngest one is graduating from Litchfield High School and was made a something scholar. Turned out to be a terribly bright kid. One of his, got awards.
I wonder why.
Well, no, the funny thing is that we didn't know a thing about it. His parents went to a ceremony, when their kids were graduating from high school, not graduating, they're getting awards from the high school last week, and I get a call from my son, and he says, you know what? Sammy was made, they have a name for it, like kids who do very well, or
There's a national scholar or a merit scholar.
A merit scholar, but they have another.
From the
anyway.
SATs, there are.
And he said, we didn't know this. I said, so they asked him, why didn't you tell him? He said, This is a kid who probably is going to Brandeis, but I mean, he's got some problem because he wants to be an actor, I think. We have that, my sister's side of the family, we have a lot of that sort of thing. But I mean, we can't all be engineers, we can't all be.
Yeah, but look how you started out with the lace.
Yeah, that's right, and it took.
You do not know where, but there is a lot of engineering in doing that.
Oh,
The
no,
lace thing.
only in the manufacture, but not in the design. Design is deadly, really, really.
Okay.
But I was thinking about Stanford all this time. When we first came up here, whenever it was, 1952, I remember one thing that struck me is that everybody spoke with a New York accent. I didn't have a New York accent. I came from Connecticut, upper Connecticut. But so many people in Stanford, and I used to ask, are they all from New York? But I don't know, maybe they were. I don't know. And then the other thing was that they were, if I said I lived on Westover Road, I was treated differently. The fact that I was living in a cottage that didn't have any heat or something else didn't matter. It's Westover Road. Which also surprised me a little. I mean, I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't, it was sort of peculiar.
Was this true of the Jewish community also, or not? Was this
yeah.
a general statement?
It was the Jewish community. Well, I really didn't, I didn't get involved too much with it. I remember I joined the sisterhood when I went to, when we started, and at Bethel, because my oldest boy was in the, the school there, and when we lived in Connecticut, we never, except for the fact that my cousin and I were sent to Temple, I forgot the name of the temple, the Reformed Temple in West Hartford, or Hartford actually, when we were about 12. They decided that we were getting to be big girls, we better learn something about Judaism. They were totally, they're all Jewish, but nobody ever, where they lived, they hid it, sort of. It was never displayed. I don't remember anything Jewish occurring in our family until my aunts brought their parents over from Europe in 1934, I think it was. The first time I'd ever been to a Seder. And I would never have been to another one as a result of that one if I had anything to do. But anyhow, they decided when we were about 12, my cousin, who was my age, and I, we had to learn something about Judaism. So they sent us to the Reformed Temple. We were there for 2 years. And when I came to Stanford, I joined Bethel because I wanted to get involved. I felt this was something I never had. And I joined the sisterhood, and I went to meetings, and I thought, this is for the birds. This is not for me. I wasn't interested in this kind of stuff. And the women, all the things you read or hear about women who get together and they're a pain in the neck and are not nice. And so I felt I didn't meet anybody there that I wanted to stay friends with, truthfully.
And that was different when you joined Sinai?
Things were different. The temple was different. At that time, Bethel had they had a built-in group that were, that had the old-timers. And it was not, I wasn't part of that, and I didn't even want to be part. It wasn't something that I wanted to get into. It's just not something that I felt I would fit in with. But when we went to Temple Sinai, the kids were in the school, and I did what I wasn't particularly active. I guess I didn't, I don't know, I guess I didn't have too much in common with these people, except we're all Jewish, we belonged to the same temple, and we had kids.
Well, you weren't expecting many women engineers, were
That's
you?
perfectly true.
So
And I think one of the problems was my husband was totally uneducated. interested. I mean, he would show up when one of the kids was doing something, was being confirmed or had something special, he would come with me. But he really was totally uninterested. And meanwhile, I had other outlets. I mean, I had the women engineers that we were active with and we were working with. I also joined the League of Women Voters here in Stamford, which was that we had a very nice group. It's come back now, I understand, but the people who are running it are 2 generations younger than we are. In fact, I asked one of the old timers recently whether, when she went to a meeting, I said, is there any of our old timers there? She said one, and the one woman she mentioned is not somebody that we would run to join. But that's, so I really wasn't, I don't know when I began. I guess after my husband died, which is 31 years ago, I figured, look, I better do something. I don't know. I didn't do anything. I didn't, this was not conscious at all. It was just,
Well, having 4 kids,
yeah, but,
having 4 kids and working in the business
yeah.
and running a home. Now, did your husband do much while he was in terms of the home?
He lived here. My husband was a typical oldest Jewish grandchild with 5 aunts. And he and his cousin, Morty, the one that I mentioned, whose wife was an engineer, did the same thing. They, in that generation, which is just a little bit before.
No, it hasn't changed until really
I
the
guess
last 10 to 15 years.
that's
So,
true.
so I didn't expect that he would, but I think that women did have very important and time-demanding roles with kids and home, and if you also had a business,
I
you were
guess,
busy.
I guess, that was true, except I never worried too much about that. I never had, thank God, the children were never a problem very much, more than children are ever problems. One of them, my second son, used to do things that sometimes would drive me crazy. And after they started going to college, we'd run into things that would happen. But thank God, we never really had any serious problems with any of the kids.
Now, after your husband, you're going to, Evelyn, we realize you didn't talk about dates, so would you please tell us some of the dates
Yeah, well, the dates are
in your life?
easy.
Okay.
Dates are, let's see, my parents were born, each were born in 1895. And I was born in 1921. I had to stop and think about this. And my husband was born in 1915. We were married in 1944. My oldest child, Joe, was born in 1947. And the next one, Ivan, was born in 1949. And the next one, Dan, was born in 1951, and my youngest, my daughter, was born in 1953.
Do you want to tell us where your parents came from?
Well, my mother came from Poland, but the part that the Kaiser had, was in
Which
charge
part?
of, right? And because they came from that part of Poland, that she went through school. But of course she left there when she was 12, so she went through school for, I guess, as long as they keep kids in school.
And your father?
And my father came from a town, my father was a funny guy. He was very funny and very entertaining and very talented, and he wrote very well, wrote poetry. Just didn't make a living. But he came from a part of Russia that we found in the Jewish Historical Society library. We found a town that had a name similar to their name. My maiden name was Vernick, V-E-R-N-I-C-K. And there's a town in Russia that had a similar it sounded a little, well, the name of his town was Rachmas Rivke. And that town had 4 or 5 people with similar names. You know, they have all this material in the library in our historical society library. And I was under the illusion until I was grown up that he was born here in the United States. His family apparently came here quite early, and they were all educated here in the States, and he was the oldest of 5. He had 3 sisters and a brother. The brother died last summer at the age of 99. The sisters all, except the oldest sister who had died of cancer, but the 2 younger ones, they each died and they were well along. They were in their 90s, one of them was in her 90s, and one of them was in her late 80s. And a very talented family. They were very creative. In fact, the youngest sister was one of the people who, she worked for Max, not Disney, earlier than Disney. Used to do the Betty Boop cartoons, and she was one of the cartoonists. In fact, she's listed in some of the books that were written by some of these people who were in the business. Anyhow, that was my father's family. They were very creative in that area, artistically, and all were able to write very well. As I said, the youngest brother was an accountant, dull, very dull man, but he lived a long, long, long time. And that was my father's family. Did we get me in time enough yet?
I think we did,
I think
yes.
so,
I
too.
think we're up to reflections as to, is there anything more that you'd like to say about the community, about where you see Stamford compared to other communities, or how you feel about having lived so much of your life in one community?
Well, I'm happy to have been able to live this long in Stamford. I think Stamford's a very good town to live in many respects, and there really is nothing much I could compare it with, because I was a young kid when we lived in West Hartford, and not a very old kid, and we moved out to Hartford. And I found that many of the things, many of the reasons that I wanted to move to a city like this so my children wouldn't have unhappy experiences, religious unhappy experiences, and they didn't. So we were able to avoid that. Unfortunately, my husband was never comfortable here. He was a Brooklyn guy. You know, these guys who come from Brooklyn never leave Brooklyn, I think. He was never really completely comfortable in Stamford, the way I am perfectly comfortable with whoever I run into. And but look, he was happy enough here. We lived comfortably here.
Did you visit Brooklyn a lot after you moved here?
Not much. There wasn't, when his parents died, his mother died many years ago. He didn't, it was his stepmother. He was never very close to her. But his father died many years before that. No, we didn't miss it very much.
Okay.
But as I said, I really think that these New York guys, these New York boys from Brooklyn, maybe from the Bronx too, it's never out of their system. They never forget that. They never leave it. They're always. But that's. Listen, other than that, look, I'm still alive. I'm apparently fairly healthy, I don't know. And I have no complaints at the moment.
That's wonderful. That's the way to be.
I think it's the only way you can be and stay alive a long time.
maybe that's the clue, so you think about that. Thank you, Evelyn.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Boy, whoever gets a chance to do this much talking. I took a course many years ago at the high school at Stamford High, before they had rip-on bills, if I'm not mistaken, where they on painting. And of course I'd painted before, but I felt I could use a little. Anyhow, my friend Nell came with me, and she was sitting in front of me, and this is a picture of Nell Jaffe, Jaffe, who was a member of our temple, and her family, her husband and her father, whose name was Jacks, Jackches, I think, gave the everlasting light that hangs above the bema. They were the ones who a book, an agent, literary agent. So that was Nell. And the rest of these are just paintings that out my back window usually. This
There's two different
yeah,
scenes.
the same area. This was right out the back window, and that was a little bit farther. Both those trees are. We used to have birch trees here, and they've disappeared over the years. Birch doesn't grow anymore. It's gotten too warm for birch.
And that's a dog of yours?
Oh no, that.
I'm gonna say it here because this is where.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was my dog Lily. She must have been about 15 at that time, 14 or 15. She and the dog Philip and Lily were the two dogs at that time. And those were the days, we didn't used to name dogs people names. That's much more recent than this. This was a long time ago. But I remember the vet who died not too long ago always was intrigued because he had a brother-in-law and sister-in-law named Philip and Lily. And I had the little picture, and my son had it enlarged and gave me that in the frame. And then the others are mostly my sister and me, or me. And what else have we got here? I don't remember what I have here. This is my mother. She was about, she must have been about 97 at that time.
And this is your mother.
Yeah. They were having a party or something over at the nursing home. His name is Alexander Fowler.
What were you gonna tell us about him?
What I was going to say is that when we moved here, Rabbi Ehrenkrantz came here about the same time, and people used to stop Alex on the street and say, "Hello, Rabbi," because he looked just like Ehrenkrantz in those days. And what happens is Ehrenkrantz got thinner and yellower. Alex always had very nice coloring.